Hi, my name is Nicole Washington, and welcome to my HCDE 313 Intro to User Research Final Reflection. I chose to focus on interior design because I read that it directly affects productivity in a workspace. Since the relationship between people and their environment is mutually influential, I thought it would be interesting to investigate that interaction. I ended up developing this design question to scope my project and focus my interests. How can we improve the interior design of Odegaard Library to encourage and increase student productivity? With my design question, I created a few goals: to identify what spatial arrangements are beneficial and which ones are unsuitable for students, and to address how we can leverage interior design practices to promote productivity in popular workspaces like Odegaard Library. Another personal goal was for me to learn about a field that I wasn't necessarily interested in and understand the power of user research in design. One of the first studies in the quarter was the field observation, or deep hanging out. First, I conducted three 30-minute field observations and concluded that there were three findings that I will dive into in a moment. The field observations were my favorite study because I didn't have to interact with anybody, and I already liked people watch, so it was fun just to be able to sit there and sketch and draw and take notes on behaviors around me. When I conducted my field observations on each floor of Odegaard, I was nervous and self-conscious about how undercover I was being. Like I said, I love people watching, but I found it to be much harder to do it and enjoy it while typing, sketching, observing, and thinking all at the same time. For my observations, I did an affinity diagram, which was one of the most tedious tasks to do on a computer. I learned that digital diagramming is not for me, but the experience taught me how valuable grouping can be when looking for high-level themes. I thought that it was extremely overwhelming at times. These observations led me to conclude that people had specific criteria for what seats they think are desirable. I found that there were mismatched design artifacts in the library, and that many students studied by themselves and as far away from others as possible. Next, I conducted three semi-structured interviews to learn more about the emotions behind the behaviors that I observed in the field study. I found some new findings and I validated old ones. The interviews required a certain level of professionalism, which was hard for me to maintain when I was interviewing people I was familiar with. Coming up with interview questions was not very difficult for me. It was the follow-up questions that I struggled to seamlessly integrate into my interviews. I thought it was fun, but transcribing was the worst part. For part of my interviews, I made my participants sketch, which proved to be really helpful because some participants were better at visualizing their thoughts rather than speaking on them. I was able to gather valuable information by giving my participants a chance to show me how they like to study. From the interviews, I found that comfortability was really important, especially when it came to seating. I also validated a finding from my previous study that students like to study alone. Lastly, I learned that students prefer studying with natural elements such as natural lighting from windows, wooden tables, chairs, and like plant life inside of the library. Finally, I conducted a survey where I developed three more findings that encompassed elements from the previous studies from the field observation and interviews. I found the surveys to be the hardest to analyze, but the easiest to construct. When trying to construct my survey, while it took me less time than the interview questions, I was surprised at how difficult it was to come up with survey questions that were not biased or poorly worded. I ended up using a 10-question survey to attempt to validate findings from the past. I was mostly interested in the rating, ranking, and open-ended questions in my survey. One thing that I found was particularly frustrating was the fact that participants' answers across questions were not consistent or conclusive. For example, even though a participant rated the experience of Odegaard to be a 4 on the emotional scale, they left several complaints in the open-ended question. The small sample size also negatively impacted my ability to draw conclusions from the data. From the surveys, I found that open-ended questions are very helpful for getting to the root of issues because participants were direct and honest about how they felt about the library. Their complaints were personalized, yet I was still able to find themes throughout the responses. In addition, I found that people who typically study alone do not like when strangers sit next to them, which also validated some of my findings on privacy and individualism from the past. There are a few downfalls and limitations to doing a field study. For me, the 30-minute sessions felt like they were too short and I wasn't able to capture the full student experience. Odegaard is also very large, and I feel like I wasn't able to capture everything that I needed to. And sometimes my own bias and assumptions on how I felt about Odegaard possibly could have came off in my findings or in my report. As for the interviews, I felt like 3 wasn't enough. I felt like leading questions were really hard not to ask, and that only having 3 interviews was an unrepresentative sample of the people who actually work in Odegaard, especially because the students that I interviewed were all undergrads. Lastly, with surveys, there were too many neutral responses to my rating questions, which made it hard to evaluate. The poor design of some of my questions also made the analytics very difficult, and I needed more participants to level out the bell curve and make it more conclusive. Here are a few of the lessons that I learned from the study. Research is the basis of all design decisions. Analyzing data is very difficult. Small sample sizes of participants makes data statistically insignificant. Research feels like it's never finished, and that I value and appreciate research, but it's not necessarily my forte. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching.